It's taken me a long time to come to terms with what happened in my house in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I'm finally ready to share. To give a little background, my family, mum, dad, older brother and I moved to Tennessee in 1995 from Mexico. We moved to a very old ranch-style home in Knox County and didn't realize that this home would be the site of some of the most harrowing and terrifying experiences I've ever had. I am convinced that many occurrences have been suppressed in my mind, but I want to share with you the memories I do remember. My hand is shaking as I type this out, as these experiences haunt me to this day and are not easy to talk about. The activity in the house first began with the usual paranormal stuff you hear about. Missing items, misplaced or moved belongings, strange creaks and noises around the house. Nothing that can't logically be explained. It wasn't until we decided to add a room to the home, about 4 or 5 months in, that it really began to hit the fan. I began to experience unusual things a few times a week to almost every single night thereafter. To give some perspective as to the layout of the home, upon entering, the living room is the first thing you see. To the left is a small hallway leading to my parents' bedroom. To the right of the living room is a very long and narrow hallway that leads to a guest room. Then the room my brother and I shared for a short while. The hall ends with a bathroom and the entryway to the kitchen, and extra room directly across from my brother's and my room. Essentially, my room was on the complete opposite end of the house from my parents' room. Anyway, now that the picture is set, I will describe several of my experiences. While my brother slept in my room, I would experience nightly terrors in which I would see someone standing at my doorway. It would never move, but the only way to describe it was a tall, shadowy figure with noticeably long, white string-like hair. It would watch me several times a week, and I would feel so terrified that all I would be able to do is cover my head with my blanket and pray it would go away. I told my parents what I had seen after the first night, but they merely chalked it up as me having a nightmare. Typical. Eventually, it got to a point where I began to sleep on my side with my blanket over my head, with a small opening for me to look through. This continued for 2 years until my brother got his own room. That's when things really took a turn for the worst. I remember sleeping at night and seeing the same shadowy figure standing at my doorway. Feeling just as terrified as the previous times seeing it, I did the usual go-to and covered my face with my blanket, hoping upon uncovering myself, it would be gone. This time was very different. Upon uncovering my face, the same figure was standing in the room, merely feet from my bed. I panicked and covered my head again, wondering if I was going mad. Upon uncovering my head once again, I saw that it had gone, and with a sigh of relief, I turned onto my back. This was not a good move. Upon turning onto my back, I saw the same figure was now floating over my bed on the ceiling. I was on the top bunk, so you can imagine how close it is now. The only way I can accurately describe this humanoid-like entity is that it looked like a mix of grey alien and a very tall crypt keeper from that one show. The second I saw it, I covered my face once again and felt absolutely petrified with fear. I then felt the figure lay on top of me as I lay frozen on my back. I remember hearing its breathing, sounding like a quiet, almost asthmatic wheeze, and how cold its breath felt. I remember the distinct earthly smell emanating from its mouth as it breathed inches from my face, the only barrier being my blanket. It felt like hours passed, frozen in terror, feeling completely helpless. This occurrence was something that began to happen almost every night, and only happened to me, maybe because I was the youngest. Throughout my time living in that house, things progressively got worse. I would be lying in bed, reading a book with all the lights on, when I would begin to hear scratching under my bed. I would peek under and be overcome with the same paralysis I would feel at night, and the feeling of the figure lying on top of me. I would feel it pull me off my bed and onto the floor in the middle of my room, and stare into my soul as I kept my eyes closed in sheer terror. My mum would later recount several times in which she would walk into my room and see me lying in the middle of the room on my back. She would ask me what I'm doing, to which I would essentially snap out of it and tell her I was fine, too scared to talk about what had happened. I remember if I slept on my chest, I would feel a force would pick me up 2 to 3 feet by my shirt and drop me back onto my bed. This happened so often that to this day, I'm reluctant to sleep on my chest, not because I'm afraid I'll be picked up, now a 220-pound adult man, good luck, but because something in my subconscious mind tells me that it's not a good position to be in. My parents would tell me that I just had nightmares all the time, but they didn't realize that this nightmare was something I experienced every night. Years later, having endured this every night, I began to see an additional apparition in the home. I began to see a young boy in the long stretch of narrow hallway that my bedroom was situated in. I would see him peeking out of different rooms at me while I was in the hallway, only to disappear out of sight into rooms, and then only to see that he had disappeared upon my investigation. That would be the extent of my interaction with him, but I would see him often, and only during the daytime. The apparition did not appear to be malicious, unlike the other figure that tormented me at night. He gave me the impression that he was merely an observer, which was comforting, in a way, that this ghost did not want to mess with me, unlike that crypt keeper entity. Over a decade later, now living in Atlanta, I decided to look up the address on Google Maps to show a friend, and noticed that the home was now the site of a home business. Upon seeing that, I decided I would reach out to them out of curiosity to see if they had any similar experiences. The business would later reply saying that they had never had more electronic issues in the home than anywhere they had ever been, and that strange things occurred frequently. He told me that his wife and kids complained about seeing a little boy wandering around the hallway and was scared to live in the home. The man also described seeing a tall shadow occasionally when he was working in his office, which actually turned out to be my old bedroom. He told me he always felt like he was being watched, and generally felt uneasy in that room in particular. What is peculiar about this is that I had not described any of my experiences prior to him telling me his, yet our stories appeared to line up. Unfortunately, I've not been able to get information on the house specifically, aside from the current tenant's experiences. I do know the area was near the core battleground of the Battle of Campbell's Station in 1863. Aside from that, I've been unable to get more information. I showed my parents the message thread I had with this business, and it was then that they confirmed that they believed the house was haunted. They didn't want to say anything that would scare me even more, and tried to bury it under the guise that I was having nightmares. My mother said that she would see the same little boy wandering around the kitchen and hallway, and she always felt that feeling of being watched when no one was home but her. Neither of them had seen the tall figure, and it seemed it was focused on me. I hold no resentment towards my parents. They're just more traditional and didn't really believe in ghosts. They probably handled the situation wrong, but realistically, most parents would have handled it the same, especially their generation. The experiences I had in that home are permanently burned into my mind, and I will never forget that tall, wire-haired figure that constantly picked me up, laid on me, and pulled me around, terrifying me to the core. I don't plan on ever returning to that home, and I pray no one who has the misfortune of living there experiences what I did on a nightly basis for 6 years. I've always been curious about deep hypnosis and what it may reveal to me, but I am equally terrified to remember events that my own mind deemed it too traumatic to keep in my conscious mind. So back in 2017, I decided I'd had enough of the lifestyle I was living. I had finished university, but hadn't got anywhere with my degree, and decided a change was necessary. This change came in the form of moving to France to do a winter season and test my luck at snowboarding. Myself and an old friend quickly found jobs as chalet hosts and relocated to Chamonix, France. Our little apartment was based at the bottom of Mount Brevant, and we shared this with 3 other girls. For a bit of context, the layout of the apartment meant that me and my friend shared a room, then 2 other girls shared the opposite room to ours, and then the final girl, who was also acting supervisor, had her own section of the apartment, complete with a separate kitchen and bathroom to the ones we 4 shared. After a few weeks, my friend got a boyfriend and began staying at his place most nights. Once this started, I began having odd dreams. In these dreams, I'd be flying around the room backwards, able to see myself asleep on the bed, but not able to slow down or control myself, shooting around the room and under the bed and back out again. This was a little scary, but I was smoking a lot and just put it down to lucid dreaming. I'm familiar with astral projecting, but again, just thought it was from the smoke. On one of these nights, while zooming around my bedroom asleep, I saw that there was a shadow in the corner of the room watching me while I slept. When I looked back down at myself, I saw both my legs raised in the air in an awkward position. I quickly woke up and found that my legs were actually in that position. This creeped me the hell out, as I'd never experienced anything like this before. Creepy, yes, but not the scariest part yet. One night, my friend was staying at her boyfriend's, as was one of the other girls, and the supervisor was out having drinks at her friend's. The other girl from opposite me, let's call her Charlotte, had gone out for a drink, but due to having an early get-up the next day, decided to come home at around 11 p.m. This was a decision she came to regret. So let's skip to the following morning. I woke up after a great night's sleep and was coming out of my room to go to the bathroom. Before making it in, Charlotte swung open her door in floods of tears. I mean, this was a girl I'd only known a couple of weeks, and we were not at the point of feeling comfortable enough to cry to one another, so this did catch me off guard. I managed to calm her down to the point of being able to speak coherent, which was when she told me everything that unfolded that night. This girl would have gained nothing from making up such a story, not to mention the crying. She explained that she was asleep, and in her dream, she got a bee stuck in her hair, and the buzzing was so intense it woke her up. Only, the buzzing didn't stop when she awoke. As she scanned her room for the source of the sound, she saw a woman stood at the foot of her bed and blocking the door. Initially, she thought that my friend had come home drunk and stumbled into the wrong room, but after calling her name and her eyes adjusting to the darkness, she realized this wasn't the case. Instead, an unknown woman glared down at her. She began shouting at her to leave, but the woman simply crossed her arms and smirked mockingly at Charlotte. After a few moments of being mocked, she plucked up the courage to lunge at the light switch, which was to the side of where the woman was stood, and as if by magic, she disappeared. Charlotte was understandably shaken up at this point and left the light on to try to control herself, only this wasn't the end of her waking nightmare. With the lights on and sat up in her bed, she watched as the blanket began to pull off of her. This happened continuously. Every time she would pull the cover back up, it would be pulled back down, and eventually would be pulled completely off of her, landing at the other side of the room. She explained how she was frozen and spent the rest of the night sat up in bed with the lights on, crying. During this period, she heard laughs of mocking and just waited for the moment she heard someone else wake up in the apartment, this being me. She later told me how she was sensitive to ghosts, with this not being her only experience. She spoke of a time when she was younger and would tell her mum about the boy in the wall in her house. Her concerned mum arranged for a priest and a psychic to visit the house, where it was discovered that a boy had died in the property and his remains were found in the walls of the house. They had to get the police involved, although it was determined that the body was 100+ years old. Her family home was a converted nunnery, and there had been reports of lots of abuse happening within the convent. Her mum later paid a visit during the season and confirmed all of this. Least to say, I was scared by these events, even though they didn't happen to me directly. I spent the rest of the season in fear of the next time I would be in my apartment on my own, not wanting to meet the ghost lady. After this, no one witnessed any more strange occurrences, despite us being there another 5 months after this happening. The most that happened was hearing a door slam shut, which I quickly brushed off as the wind, even though no doors or windows were open. I was under the belief of not giving it any more attention, in the hope that it wouldn't fuel it to do any more. We spoke to our boss, who owns the property, and although concerned at what we had seen, he did express that no other seasonaires had mentioned anything of the sort happening. I thought about this for a long time after, wanting more answers as to who this woman was. The only explanation I could come up with is that around a 10-minute walk away from our apartment, there was a cemetery. In this cemetery, there was a wall dedicated to all who had lost their lives exploring the mountain. These were individuals from all over the world who had come to this area to explore the mountains, but weren't lucky enough to make it back home. I believe this woman was an English explorer who had lost her life there and was drawn to Charlotte, not only because she was sensitive to these things, but also because the woman was trapped in a country where few would understand her to communicate. Either way, this was a scary experience to all involved, and has only piqued my interest in the paranormal further. So I used to live in a private house. It was a 3-bed family home, but it was shared with other families. I remember the home layout perfectly well. When you walk in through the door, you have the bathroom in front of you and the kitchen to your right. To your left is a large living room and the bedroom after it. The bedroom was small, but it was enough for a small family. It was me, my dad and my mum. We weren't far from stores, like 5 stores and 2 supermarkets. My father was at work doing security or EMS. I don't remember too much of what he did, so it was me and my mother. She wanted to go to the market that day, and I was in the bedroom watching TV. We had a high riser, a bed that goes under the other and pulls out when you're ready to sleep, leveling with the other bed. I was sitting on the bottom one when my mother comes into the room, asking if I wanted to go with her or stay at home. I'm not sure if at the time leaving your child alone in a house was against the law, but yeah, this was in the 80s. Of course I chose to stay home because me, a kid, and TV. So the usual mother-child rules of leaving their child alone in the house. No opening the door, do not leave the room, and just stay watching TV. Me and your father have the key. My mother leaves the house, and I faithfully stay to the TV, watching her go out of view to the end of the block, which, again, wasn't far at all. Now, I turn to watch the TV. Suddenly, the TV starts becoming messed up, and I start messing with the bunny ears, to realize it's not working. I change the channels, and it's all white noise. I hear something. My name. I'm thinking my mum is back, and I walk to the bedroom door. I look ahead, and no one is there. My mother had not come back, so there should be no one in the house. I stayed quiet though, in case someone was at the door. Again, I'm in the bedroom, and you can see straight to the kitchen. I go back and stare at the TV that was no longer showing a picture, but just static, that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. But I was a kid, so I wasn't sure how TV worked. Again, I heard my name. I turned my head and looked to the bathroom door, staring at it. Hearing my name, I was rather shocked. It wasn't my mother, and my dad wasn't home. Again, I heard my name, and there were steps, but it wasn't what footsteps sounded like. It wasn't a pit-pat of flat feet. It was the sound of hooves, like a horse, but slowly, with caution, as if aware. There was one step after my name was said. It wasn't a firm voice. It was more of a whimpering call, as if luring someone. I stand up and walk again, slowly this time, towards the bedroom door and look out. Looking straight ahead was the living room, the bathroom and the kitchen. You could see half the fridge as well, as it was casting a shadow from the light that came in through the window. 2 hoof noises happened again, and slowly, the shadow of the fridge moves. I'm thinking someone is in the driveway, moving around, until I saw the shadow form. There was no longer a shadow behind the fridge. It was next to the fridge, and there was a shadow image, kinda skinny, the upper body slightly arched forward. The head, shaped like a triangle with a sharp-like chin, and 2 long pointy things coming from the head. But it looked like a person just standing there, but not physically. But the bottom was where it got weird. The bottom was of 2 legs, but the legs weren't straight. They were arched back, like an animal's back legs. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I just stared at it. It stood still, but you could hear a horse slowly walking till it started to strut faster. My name whispered again as I stood in fear at the door, a split second before running into the room and hiding under the bed. I stayed there, hearing the hooves getting closer, as it was sounding like it was passing the bathroom and just going through the living room. My name still being whispered around the house. I started crying, not sure what was going on, and suddenly, just like that, you heard the keys to the front door unlocking it. The hooves stopped, the whispering died, and the TV was back to showing whatever show was on for that channel. When the door opened, I ran so fast and hugged the hell out of my mother. I cried so hard, and my mother thought someone did something to me, but I didn't know how to explain it. So I told her I was scared, and she said, "Well, I told you I was going to the supermarket, and you wanted to stay." That's all I could say to her. This was my first memory of what started, of my seeing and hearing of the paranormal. Years later, I saw the depictions of how religions had seen the devil, and I saw that it looked exactly like the image of the shadow that had first appeared to me. But by then, I had already seen so much, and admitting that you might have seen the devil at 6 years old wasn't really on my mind to tell anyone. But yeah, my first paranormal experience was the shadow of the devil himself. The only time I've actually seen a ghost was when I was 16. I'm 33 now, but I remember it clearly. I lived with my grandparents primarily and had my bedroom in the basement. They lived in their wartime house since they got married 55 years prior. They had 8 kids, and I hadn't heard of a single ghost story from my grandparents or any of my aunts and uncles. Only my cousin, who used to feed a dog under the bed, but that's another story. As part of my weird high school routine, I used to wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, have a bowl of cereal and watch Pokemon. My internal clock would wake me up, and actually, it still does sometimes. One night when I woke up, I felt a presence nearby. I looked to my right by the doorway to my room. Even though my room was pitch black, I clearly saw the figure of a man. I thought for sure someone had broken in and I was going to be raped or murdered, because this figure just didn't seem ghost-like. The figure was a young man, probably in his early 20s. He was overweight, had blonde hair and glasses, and was wearing a red t-shirt and jeans. He wasn't some ominous shadow or an old-timey Renaissance ghost. He looked just like a standard early 2000s guy. I had no idea who this person was and had never seen him before, but I remember him well to this day. I stared at him for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably 10 seconds. I waited for him to make the first move. I guessed towards murdering me, but I didn't get any evil vibes. Although I was super freaked out, this was not the image I'd conjure up when I'd think about ghosts. I finally turned my bedside lamp on, and when I did, he disappeared. At this point, I was wide awake and couldn't stop obsessing over what just happened. Again, I was scared, but he seemed harmless enough that I didn't feel the need to wake my grandparents up. I read a few chapters of my Buffy the Vampire Slayer book before trying to fall asleep again. Who the hell was this guy? And how did his spirit find his way into my grandparents' basement? Half of my childhood home, the half my bedroom was in, was built in the 1800s and was originally a farmhouse. The house itself is on the very top of a steep hill, and the woods around it, which I often explored as a kid, had the original stone fences from the farmhouse, which, in broken bits, I often found obsidian rock, which is known for spiritual protection, which isn't necessarily important to this story, but an interesting fact considering what I experienced as a kid there. The first paranormal event I remember happened when I was about 6. My sister and I still shared the same room. This room, which I'll call the Purple Room, as it was originally, although painted over, a very deep dark purple. One night, my sister woke me up yelling. At first I was confused and tired, until I heard what she was yelling about. Coming from the window was the sound of wet hands squeaking in an aggressive way. It was not raining, and the room is on the 2nd floor, away from any trees, and was too high for anyone to climb to make such a noise. So, both petrified, we ran to tell our parents and have them check. But the noise stopped as soon as my dad came in. So we went back to bed, and not 5 minutes later, it started again. And so again, we ran and had our dad check. And just as previously, it was silent. Nothing. This cycle happened one more time before we just slept downstairs. But whatever it was very strategic about its actions and who it wanted to present to. The second paranormal event happened shortly after my sister moved her bed to the room beside mine. In other words, it happened as soon as it was only me in the Purple Room. I was around 7 or 8, I think, and was crying whilst putting away my laundry. I can't quite recall the reason I was crying, but I remember it being something petty. Perhaps it was because I had to do the laundry. Regardless, I suddenly stopped for no apparent reason, as I remember still feeling upset, but I stared blankly about the room. You know that blank stare you'd make as a kid, trying not to cry whilst being scolded? It was that kind of blank stare. Anyway, I then looked up and saw a hooded old man. He was maybe 5'6", but only visible from the shoulders up. He was like a hologram, in a way, see-through but extremely clear, and a white, slight pale bluish colour. I don't know if he emitted light, as it was broad daylight when this happened, but he was extremely detailed, and I can still remember the pores on his large nose and sagging cheeks. He had thin lips with deep smile lines, I think they're called, and his eyes weren't visible, but his eye bags were. His eyes themselves were covered by the hood he was wearing, and the hood itself was rounded and sat flat on his head, and wasn't pointed or anything. He then just disappeared after a minute. I wasn't scared, but he just had a sour old man vibe, and once he disappeared, I just finished my laundry calmly and went back downstairs. After this sighting, I had named him Newman. Not sure where the name came from, but it's spelt specifically with an uppercase for whatever reason. After that, I started talking to him and them. I don't know where them came from, but yeah. Just about my day and about random things I found outside. He and them never talked back, but I could tell it was appreciated when I did, and the days I didn't, I felt something waiting and would apologize and say I'd talk to them tomorrow. Around this age, still 8, maybe closer to 9 now, my friend and I started using a spirit board at recess. This is what I think started the Shadow Man sightings. This spirit, I knew, wasn't Newman. Newman had a comforting feeling in his sternness. This spirit was just fear-inducing. It would lay under my bed, in a way where its head would be visible from the shoulders up, and although it was just a black mass, you could distinguish its limbs and head and stuff. Anyway, it would stay in that position at night until I would spot it, and then it would rush underneath my bed in reverse. By that I mean its feet would rush to the head of the bed, so its shoulders and up were also under the bed, if that makes sense. But when it did this, it would make rushing or moving noises on the stuff underneath my bed, garbage bags and stored stuffed animals that I rotated on my bed, and a hard plastic bin with winter blankets and clothes. It was a very distinct and disturbing whoosh sound. This shadow man or figure would also knock on the walls a lot. I have a video of these knocks on my old iPod somewhere, but these knocks had the same fear-inducing vibes, and were not Newman either. This never went away, but the fear became manageable, and the experiences lessened the less scared I was. It was during that same period of time when I saw Newman for a second time. I was up late on my iPod, and felt the presence to my right, which I feel like I should add that to my right was a wall my bed was pushed against. Anyway, so I looked to my right, and there was a single eye, an old man's left eye, piercing back at me in an annoyed and frustrated expression, and was the same hologram, hyper-realistic appearance of the sighting I had of him before. It made me jolt, but I didn't feel threatened by it. Like before, just felt like I was being lectured, but it disappeared as soon as it came. After that, I turned my phone off and went to bed. I did tell my parents the next day, but was ignored. These two incidents happened when I was 12 or 13, and they happened outside of the Purple Room. and are the only two that have happened in the house outside of the room, although they were both on a site that was built in the 1800s, which is strange. Anyway, the first incident, I was upstairs and home alone. I was in the purple room and heard papers being shuffled downstairs. Confused as I was home alone, I paused my music to get a better listen, but after I paused my music, the shuffling of papers got louder and became aggressive, as if someone was throwing paper after paper in a fit trying to look for something frantically, or just annoyed at something. I then walked out of my room, over to the top of the stairs to look down to see if I could see anything. The noise still continued, and I could tell that the noise was coming from the right side of the staircase, which is to the right side of the home office area at the end of a hallway, and right beside the front door, which is important for the next story. Anyway, I didn't see anything, but could still hear it, so I took a step down the stairs, and it immediately stopped, as if it knew I was there. So I ran back to my room and jammed the door shut until someone came home. No one had broken in upon checking, so it was dismissed by my parents. The second incident, I was downstairs in the kitchen when I heard a loud, aggressive knock on the front door, the one beside the home office where I heard the papers. My sister was supposed to be dropped off by a friend that day, so I went over to the front door figuring she was annoyed. I unlocked it and opened it and looked around on the screened porch, but she wasn't there. So I checked the door on the screen porch that led to the outside, and it was locked. So I knew it wasn't her or another person, as it was a brick house and the porch was half brick, so no one could get into it without you hearing it or noticing a cut screen panel. So, freaked out and aware that it's not good to open the front door for a spirit to let them into your home, especially not one that's knocking angrily, I went back to the front door that leads inside and said, "You're not allowed in, leave," and then shut and locked the door again. I then returned to the kitchen, and immediately the door handle started violently shaking up and down, and the door was shaking as if someone was trying to push it. I went back and shouted, "Get out," kind of hopelessly, but after that, it only continued for under a minute, and then it stopped abruptly. For whatever reason, I felt like the paper shuffling and the door were related, as I got the same aggressive and frantic, annoyed feeling from them. The last two incidents that happened before I moved were both involving Newman. I was around 15 or 16, and I hadn't had any contact from Newman in a while, and wasn't sure if he was still there or if it was just the more sinister spirits now. So home alone one day, I told him out loud I doubted his presence, but would still like to hear from him. I asked him that if he was still here, to move my desk chair. I told him he had 30 minutes, and that I would go downstairs and come back up after that time, and so I did, and when I came back upstairs, the chair was in the center of my room. Me thinking I might have misplaced the chair in the center instead of at the desk, then asked him to move it again, back to my desk to confirm it was him, and again I gave him 30 minutes, and when I came back upstairs, he was back at the desk where I'd asked him to move it. Seeing it move the second time made me go as pale as a ghost. The chair, although small, with wheels, was an older chair, so it was pretty heavy at the base. I was never able to lift it more than 2 feet. After that, I said thank you, and that I received the sign, but I was still just shaken. The last incident was the same sighting of his left eye, but this time to the right side of my bed and up higher than my eye level and looking down. Not like it was before, staring eye to eye. This time, it also didn't make me jump, but I can't remember what I was doing before. I just remember seeing him, then him disappearing, then me turning off the light and going to bed. Overall, the house was strange, but other than the window incident my sister also experienced, no one else saw or heard anything. For whatever reason, it was only me, and since moving, I haven't had any encounters with any entities. But I still feel like, and in a way hope, that Newman has stayed with me. I was 6 years old and living with my grandparents. I remember being a bit of a baby about sleeping in my own bed, but both my grandparents were out of town, so they told me earlier in the day to sleep in my bed, and if I needed anything, I need to go tell my uncle, who lived there, if any problems arose. Well, I got put to bed early. I'm not exactly sure the time, but it was before sundown. I still remember being frightened by having the door closed. So, as a kid, I used to demand that if I was in my room, I have the doors open so I could see if anything was coming at me. Anyway, I awoke at night, and I remember being terrified. I flipped over and looked down the pitch-black hallway, staring, just waiting for something to come out. I wanted to scream for my uncle, but I got in plenty of trouble for bothering him in the past, so I just sat there, horrified some monster would come out. Well, I remember laying on my right-hand side, looking down the hallway. I blinked once and opened my eyes to see a translucent figure in the hallway. After confirming what I saw with my eyes, I froze in terror, trying not to scream, because I didn't want this figure to see me. Just as I gained a bit of composure, as best as a 6-year-old could, the figure turned to me, where I could make out more of its figure. It was a woman, most likely in her early 20s. She had a longer bob haircut, donning a spaghetti-strap dress that expanded down at the bottom, just right above the knees, with a very slender outline. Still, I couldn't make out the color or intricate details. All I know was she was translucent, with the only color I could make out was white, as if she was a cloud formed to a human outlining. After I caught most of her details, she lifted her arm in a very gentle manner and did a bit of a long wave goodbye towards me and descended down the stairs at the very edge of the hallway. I remember getting up, turning on the lights, and screaming for my uncle, who had a room downstairs from me. He never came upstairs to check it out. I remember getting so worked up, but so fearful to leave my room, I just crawled under my bed and fell asleep. Anyways, I figured I would share this experience, and I was wondering if anyone saw something similar in their lives. I tell people this as a 30-year-old man, and people, from co-workers to friends, laugh at me for bringing it up. We all have a reason that we sleep facing away from the door at night, and here is mine. Have you ever stared into a mirror when the lights are dim, and you saw your face morph into something else? Have you ever looked at one spot of a wall of a dimly lit room and kept your eyes there until you saw a figure in the corner of your eye? I call these figures phantasms. A phantasm is a ghost that is only a figment of your imagination. This creepy story is about a phantasm that I saw repeatedly when I was about 6 or 7. The question that comes across my mind sometimes now is, was it a phantasm? Or was it real? One night, when I was little, I went to bed as usual. I glanced at one part of my wall, and for whatever reason, I kept staring there. Eventually, floating straight out of my sister's door, I saw a figure that looked like a man under a teal-colored sheet, pretending to be a ghost. The odd thing was, he was 7.5 feet tall as our ceiling, and slightly translucent. Also, coming off of the body of this creepy apparition were two long, skinny arms that looked like they were covered in black, shiny scales. These arms carried small, eerie hands that had long, sharp, claw-like fingers, 3 on each hand. His head had no neck, and his neck had no shoulders. He had only a dome. And worst of all, this ghoul had 2 red, glowing balls for eyes, and a dark shadowy indent about halfway down its body for a mouth. This tall-as-the-ceiling ghost slowly inched towards me, and when it entered through my doorway, that's when I tried to look at it to see what it was. As soon as I did that, it was gone in an instant. My question was it real? Out of curiosity, I kept on doing this. I kept on staring straight at that same point on my wall, and each night I did this, in the corner of my eye, I always saw the same ghost. Each time, it was the same 7.5-foot ghost, with those same crooked little arms, and those same beady little eyes, and the same humongous mouth. And each time, I always shut my eyes, looked away in fear, or maybe I would even look at it directly to see what it was. And every time I would do one of these 3 things, it would disappear. One night, I said to myself, I'll keep looking at the same part of the wall to see what happens. And so, when I lay down in my bed, I did exactly that. I stared at that spot on my wall, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the ghost inching towards me. However, when it came into my room, I kept staring, not at the ghost, but at the spot on the wall. Then, to my surprise, it started to back up out of my room. Then it turned around, entered the hallway, and walked out of sight. Despite it leaving, I kept to my word and kept staring at the wall. It did come back, but this time it was running towards me, or I guess floating at higher speed, since it had no legs. This would be scary enough, but sadly it was carrying something with it. My heart raced in fear as I saw the ghoul at the corner of my eye, stretching its arms back behind its back, and then over the top of its head, it swung a massive battle axe. Then it heaved the axe down onto the side of my gut, as if to chop me in half. Then I did not feel pain, but I felt an intense sensation of pins and needles. Then this monster of a thing faded away, smoke-like into the darkness, never to be seen again. And that's the reason why I sleep facing the wall that my bed lays against, and why I now sleep putting my head where my feet were. Sometimes I lay that same way I used to, just to see this old foe of mine, but every attempt failed, and it never came back. So this ghost may actually be gone forever. This happened when I was in middle school. I decided to join a peer church group in the hopes I could make some friends. Instead of finding friends, however, I had experiences so frightening that I avoided both churches and church groups. Backstory: there was a church in the next town over that had a reputation for being haunted. My best friend told me stories about other people who had seen a squat, shadowy creature running around the church and jumping through closed doors. Coincidentally, this was the same church the peer group belonged to. It was a little nerve-wracking for me to hear, since I was going to be going to that church for a sleepover in 3 days' time. Ultimately, I decided I would be cautious, armed with this information, and still go to the sleepover. This would be one of 2 terrifying experiences I would have there. Hide and go seek. Saturday comes, and I ride out with the other kids that lived in this town to this church. We had 2 chaperones, one young man and one young woman, which would be caring for us while we were there. They both sported casual attire, tennis shoes, jeans and t-shirt, This is important for what follows. After all of us had stowed our sleeping bags and belongings in the main hall, we gathered in the common area with the kitchenette attached by a hallway that led to the main hall of the church. After a little discussion, the chaperones decided to play a game of hide and seek inside the church complex. As I already chosen my hiding place, I waited until everyone had scrambled off to find places to hide before I went to mine. In this common area, there were a set of 2 pews sitting against the back wall of the room. One of them had a piece of plywood leaning against it. To me, it was a perfect hiding place. I crawled underneath the pew with the plywood leaning against it, and lined my back up with the back of the pew to keep me from being seen from above. The plywood was wide enough that most of my body was hidden from view. However, I could still see the rest of the room and the kitchenette unimpeded. After about 5 minutes, the whole church fell silent, and then slowly, it got really quiet. I couldn't even hear the running refrigerator in the kitchenette anymore. I was so scared I held my breath, listening to the pregnant silence. Not long after, I saw from my hiding place a pair of shiny black cowboy boots silently walk from the hallway that led to the main church hall. Barely breathing, I watched intently as the boots walked into the middle of the room, stop, and turn in the direction I was hiding. The boots walked right up to where I was, and whoever, or whatever it was, grabbed the plywood and leaned it back from the pew. The shadow of a slim head darkened the plywood as whoever it was peered down towards me. Abruptly, the shadow of the head turned back towards the hall, then back down at me before putting the plywood slowly back into place. Then the boots turned and walked away and disappeared into the side wall. Shortly after, everyone, including the chaperones, came back into the common area looking for me. Startling the group, I emerged from my hiding place. "I'm here," I said, faking a smile. I couldn't tell them what I saw. I knew in my heart they wouldn't believe me. As the chaperones discussed what to do next, I took the time to look down at their feet. Both of them were only wearing tennis shoes. I spent a sleepless night listening to the hard thump and leathery creak of cowboy boots, walking back and forth between the sleeping children, and even right past me as I hid in my sleeping bag. When the light of dawn came pouring in from the stained glass window, I jumped out of my sleeping bag and packed everything up as fast as I could, glad to be gone. Preacher. A few weeks had passed since the night of the black boots. I had decided not to leave the peer church group, figuring I would be safe if I didn't go to any other sleepovers at the church. I was mistaken. One day, I was invited to stay the night at the church group leader's house and go the next day with her and her family to the Sunday sermon at the church. Despite some apprehension, I accepted the invite. After a wonderful Saturday night of country fried pork and gravy and a moonlight ride on horseback, Sunday morning arrived. It was time to go to church. Her 2 kids as well as myself were herded into the main hall and into a row of pews close to the dais where the preacher would be delivering his sermon. All 3 of us kids, still sleepy from the previous night, were quick to fall asleep to the sound of the preacher's almost monotone voice. As soon as this sermon was over and he stepped down to shake hands with the various parishioners, I was suddenly awake. Instinctively, I looked around until my eyes fell on the preacher. Something was wrong with him. Just plain wrong. I ducked into the crowd, aiming for the back of the church. When I looked back halfway to the other side of the room, I realized he was following me with each hand he shook, his milky white eyes, like that of a corpse, staring at me. Finally, I had made it to the back of the pews by the wall, scrambling underneath one and huddling behind it. I peered carefully over the top of the pew. He still was creeping closer and closer, his wrinkled face now bearing a wide, triumphant smile. He knew I was trapped. Just as he got through the crowd of parishioners and was heading straight for me, a tall man with short brown hair, wearing blue jeans and a white shirt, segmented by blue lines, stands directly in front of where I was hiding. Peering from the edge of his blue jeans, I watched as the smile fell from the preacher's lips as he locked his dead eyes with the man. An agonizing moment passed as they regarded each other before they carefully shook hands. The way those two were looking at each other was a gaze of long enemies. With one more glance down at me, the preacher turned to his right, walked away back into the crowd. As I breathed a sigh of relief, the man in jeans leaned over and quietly told me, "Get out of here and never come back." Then he also turned in the same direction and disappeared into the crowd. I ran outside as fast as I could, breathing hard from fear. I waited as far away as I could from the church for the peer group leader and her family to come out and take me home. The next day, I quit the group. Since that day, I've never set foot in that, nor any other church, alone. I know it would actually be impossible to prove anything that I would say, but even without the paranormal things, people end up also saying some weird things as well. Information that I honestly shouldn't need to know without me even asking. But honestly, I don't know when it started, but I know it was more aggressive when I visited my dad's house every year. I think it became more apparent near or after my grandma's passing. I think one of my first experiences was when one night I had turned off the family computer and was about to head to the basement while everyone else was asleep at the opposite side of the house. I used to love to dance and sing by myself with my MP3 player because it was my only form of escape. So I go to open the door, and this dark figure in a shape of a man who stood a couple of inches below the doorframe in height ran straight through me, giving me an instant migraine that went away in a second. It did freak me out, but my dumb kid self wasn't going to let him stop me, and I continued down, and near the bottom, I heard a little girl's voice say no, which I also ignored because I think my reasoning back then was, if I did what it asked me, I'd be acknowledging it, and just went on my merry way. After then, for a couple of years, I was followed by the Shadow Man. I always knew when he was there because his presence was off-putting, and I did see him multiple times. It was up until I was near the end of high school where I got spiritual and had a challenge the gods moment, where I asked them to prove their existence because I'm a ballsy kid. I had a dream that night of being tackled and lain on the floor by a deity saying that I, quote, could save my brother. I knew what they meant, oddly enough. Then a situation broke out where my ex-abusive parental figure was literally shoving their head through a damn wall. Needless to say, I believed in something at that point and asked for protection from everything that was happening. And that was the last time I had seen the Shadow Man. I'm questioning my own faith right now because I feel lost. Why did this happen? What would cling on to me for so long? And why do so many people close to me say they've seen multiple beings cling on to me? I've also had one say they'd seen an old hand on one shoulder while I was sleeping on the bus. And my bandmate said that when we played a note in sync, that a light being who was really tall formed behind me, and it freaked him out a lot.